Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you all. My name is Matthew, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's final session of our book club that has been run by Mizan here out of Sydney. For any further programs that will be running, please follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and please remember to tag any posts on social media. This evening, if you'd like to ask any questions, if you could please add them to the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best in the final part of this evening to ask the Shaykh directly the questions that you may have. In the last 6 weeks, we've seen us cover a significant amount of content, or Dr. Samir Mahmoud has covered a lot of content through key points and excerpts from Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad's book, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam and Europe. And the book, as we know, is a series of essays where Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad dissects the rise of Islamophobia on the basis of Muslim theological tradition. Although the proper response to the current impasse is clearly indicated in Quran and Hadith, some have lost the principle of the principle of trust in divine wisdom, and are responding with hatred, fearlessness, or despair. Shaykh shows that a compassion-based approach could transform. A compassion-based approach, rooted in an authentic theology of divine power, could transform the current quagmire into a bright landscape of great promise for Muslims and their neighbours. Our special guest for tonight is Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, who was educated at Cambridge, Al-Azhar, and London universities. Having founded the Cambridge Muslim College, he is also currently the Shaykh Zayed Lecturer of Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University and Director of Studies in Theology at Wolfson College. Without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Samir Mahmoud, who will begin asking questions. Welcome, Dr. Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, and welcome, Dr. Samir Mahmoud. And we hope that you enjoy this evening's talk from wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, Matthew, for that very generous introduction. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We're back for our 7th session with Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad Q&A. I'm going to ask the Shaykh, before we go to Q&A, to give us a 10-minute reflection on the book, his journey, the reasons why he wrote the book in the first place, some of the thoughts and ideas that he thought were extremely relevant, inshallah. So, Assalamu alaikum, Sidna. The floor is yours.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I assume you can hear me clearly. Apologies for the slight, shall we say, leisured pace of my mind at this pre-breakfast hour. I'm an evening person usually, but welcome to everybody in Australia. And that might be a kind of point at which to begin my set of caveats about the book, insofar as the dynamic in Australia regarding Muslims, migration, conversion, the indigenous, the extraneous, and so forth is no less intense and fast moving than it is in Europe, but it is quite different and possibly easier insofar as our dynamic in Europe is that the continent has really constructed itself as a Christendom, or as a post-Christendom, defined really by having boundaries very painfully guarded with Muslim others. The formation of nations such as Russia, Spain, southern Italy, many of the Balkan states emerges in the crucible of a fight to the death with Muslim neighbors, and currently presents itself as a tension between people whose roots are largely elsewhere and people whose roots are essentially local. Whereas in an Australian or any other sort of, I guess, Commonwealth region where white settlement has been salient, you have Muslims existing as a minority within a community that is itself a migrant community, sitting essentially on the heads of a vanquished indigenous population. which makes the dynamic somewhat different and probably somewhat easier insofar as the legitimacy of Muslims as just another wave of migrants, and in this case not aggressive colonizers but suppliants, economic migrants, asylum seekers and so forth, makes the moral case probably a lot easier to represent. The book itself is not really a proper book insofar as it doesn't have an overarching thesis, I would say, or much of a structure. It really is a set of talks that are not quite academic, but sort of middlebrow, I suppose, haute vulgarisation, given in a variety of contexts over the last 10, 15 years. And the subject matter ranges very widely over questions of migration, identity, globalization, the environment, Islamic economics, there's a chapter on the Balkans and so forth. So it is very much a collection of essays, and the idiom is, again, not really academic, but kind of essay writing in the fairly traditional English style, sort of George Orwell or Cyril Connolly, that kind of not really journalistic, and sometimes using quite fancy aspirational registers of the English language in order to convey certain things that are perceived globally and rhetorically, rather than being dependent on forensic structures of academic style argument and documentation. So the book really is more of the genre that the Sufis refer to, I suppose, as ishara rather than ibara. It kind of points, it's allusive and indicative, rather than something that attempts to define big things like Islam, the West, Europe, modernity, indigenization. It talks in terms of preponderances, I think, rather than essences and certainties. And it certainly doesn't offer any kind of clear blueprint for how this is to be negotiated, other than offering certain suggestions of how traditional Muslim wisdom, in that we are heirs, unlike Westerners, to a tradition that is intrinsically pluralistic. Muslims come from lands that have been pluralistic, multi-religious, multiracial for more than 1,000 years, whereas Europe doesn't have that deep heritage. So there's ways in which we can mobilize our identity, which is authentic insofar as it exists in dialogue with internal and external difference. But we also need to acknowledge the radical newness of the situation, because historically Muslim enculturation and engagement with other cultures took place on the assumption that one could see the origins of some kind of divinely legislated code in their forebears. And Muslims did this even in places like China and India and elsewhere, where the deep stratum of the sacred was not really monotheistic at all. Now in modern Europe, which is the world's first ever atheist continent, I would guess, and we just had our census last Sunday, actually, in the UK, and it'll be interesting to see when the numbers are crunched how many people still self-identify as religious in any sense. Certainly the suggestions are that most people in England don't consider themselves to be Christian any longer. That the old structure of respect for, but difference with, say, the Ahl al-Kitab, can't be our guiding paradigm any longer, because we're faced with people who don't have a kitab and whose outlook and horizons are determined by the fluctuations of science and certain implications of Darwinism for the way in which society might or might not survive, and certain often quite emotional and inchoate recollections of what it is to be British, Scottish, French, and so forth. Those local identities, which thanks to globalization have been fading very fast, but are now attempting to be resurrected in order to provide some kind of barrier against the sterility of a global modern culture in which nobody has a narrative at all. So it's a very complex situation, very fast moving. Even since the book came out, which was 8 months ago, we've had rapid movement in places like France, for instance. Macron's new explicitly anti-Muslim legislation in France, the closing of many mosques of the major Muslim organizations, restrictions on halal meat, etc., etc. The temperature is being raised constantly, and the book may well go out of date disastrously very quickly. So it's kind of a snapshot or a period piece, almost journalistic, rather than something that might stand as relevant, say, in 20 years' time. But we shall see. So yeah, it's a wide-ranging discussion of issues in the humanities and issues in spirituality that can't really be decisively pinned down, which means that the guiding narrative is, at best, this thing that I have defined very loosely and vaguely as traditional Islam. That's the paradigm that kind of holds the discourse together, I suppose. By which I mean not the kind of rather tight and ideologized versions of tradition that some have attempted to propose as an alternative to some of the sort of narrow, perhaps westernized, ideologized versions of Islam that emerged in the colonial period, but rather as in Thomas Bauer's concept, a culture of ambiguity. That is to say, in the absence of a church structure, the absence of a magisterium, normative Muslimness was always defined in a kind of consensual and pretty broad way. So the four madhabs with their visions of how you approach the scripture, the different schools of aqidah, the indefinite numbers of different tariqas with their particular spiritualities, different types of local and perhaps folk forms of religion. The Ummah has not been ideological, but has been, despite its agreement on the basic forms of worship and doctrine, a culture of ambiguity which has respected difference and ambiguity. And Thomas Bauer's book, which sadly hasn't been translated into English yet, but really ought to be, is a welcome reminder of how the ulama used to celebrate that broadness of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and of course the incorporation into moderate mainstream forms of Shiism as well. So that's the nearest I can get to defining where the book comes from in terms of the sort of spectrum of different Muslim opinions. It advocates what I take to be the, say, up to the end of the 19th century, the open, irenic, inclusive, but still certain culture of the Muslim narrative, and regards the more recent move towards types of fundamentalism, types of what sometimes perhaps problematically called Islamism, as being regrettable departures from the tradition, even though they present themselves as discourses of authenticity. So that's probably around about 10 minutes, is it, Samir? I don't want to grandstand. Academics sometimes need to be forcibly restrained from speaking. Well, unfortunately, it's about the only thing we can do. So let me stop at this point. I've raised a few questions, I hope, and then the rest is in your hands.
Inshallah. Thank you very much for a very wonderful summary of the book. I just make a very quick comment before I go to the question. I know you mentioned that the book isn't really a blueprint, but initially, when engaging with the book myself with a number of young university students, I did get the impression that the book does seem like perhaps intentionally or not intentionally, but maybe we're reading it that way. It can be a roadmap for the kind of perspectives, thinking, and issues we need to start thinking about. Would you agree with that statement? And if so, what other perspectives does it open up beyond that, in terms of if you had more time to push some of your arguments further?
Well, I think because there's so many disparate things that I talk about, one could speak a lot more about what is the biggest global crisis at the moment, which is climate change and the environment, and some of the allied existential risks, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, the decline in human fertility, which have really drawn a line under the whole Western triumphalist idea of progress. We now at the University of Cambridge have a Centre for Existential Risks, studying all of those technological innovations that might terminate human life. That's how real this has become. So we're moving into a post-triumphalist space that I think actually opens up a wide new arena of theological possibilities and the intelligent ressourcement of the Muslim tradition in particular, which probably of all of the transnational non-Western meta-narratives is the one that has fared least badly. It would be quite difficult to resuscitate, I don't know, Confucianism, I suspect, really authentically under current conditions. The current attempts to resuscitate Hindu tradition are highly ideologized and unreal, I think, but you can look at what goes on in most forms of Muslim religion to this day and say that is a genuine continuity and an evolution of something that is historically pre-modern and rooted and is genuinely non-Western and can be seen as an alternative. So looking at that, I think, what does it mean to be Muslim in the context of the collapse of the West's meta-narrative, which nobody really expected? Where does that leave the elites in the Muslim world that have justified their secularity in terms of the march of progress and the triumph of the West? I think they're left high and dry, and a lot of secular intellectuals in places like Morocco, for instance, are really struggling to define the validity of their own Western orientation when the West itself is talking about the validity of the indigenous and the equality of all narratives. And where does that leave the Moroccan elite? And I think the same goes throughout the Muslim world, that there's a crisis in Islam, but there's a crisis in the alternative as well. So it makes it a very exciting time. But I think the next stage really would be a more sort of philosophically exacting exploration of where one goes in a world which doesn't have the old categories that Muslims were familiar with, the Ahl al-Kitab particularly, where one goes in a world of what Imam al-Ghazali would call safsata, jahd al-ulum, this kind of maximal questioning and deconstruction of everything. What is the place of Islam, which is preeminently logocentric in the context of a world in which all stories are collapsing? In a sense, that's an answer to that is the necessary precondition for activating some of the other things that I'm speculating about in the book.
Is it safe to say, I think a lot of people are thinking right now, is that something you're working on currently, a next book on these issues and topics?
Well, it's very difficult. And in a sense, if one is deconstructing postmodernism, that's an easy thing, but also a difficult thing at the same time. Because the thing itself, to the extent that it sets itself up as a set of answers, becomes a meta-narrative and therefore is immediately going to collapse into the black hole of its own sort of epistemic void. But on the other hand, the validation of the Islamic narrative has, following Ghazali, always been something that is quite personal and experiential. And its great powerhouses have been really the Sufi lodges rather than the madrasas. And that infrastructure is very seriously degraded across the Muslim world. For whatever reason, secular opposition, modernist opposition, fundamentalist opposition. And if, following Ghazali, the great source of the validation of the Muslim meta-narrative is direct experience of transcendence, and the places where that took place are no longer accessible, how do you seriously build a mass movement in opposition to this culture of nihilism? A lot of reconstruction needs to take place in the Muslim world before that can seriously begin.
On that note, there's a question that really ties up very nicely with what you just said. We live in a world we can perhaps call birth of modern subjectivity, expressive individualism, in terms of Taylor. There's a question in the chat box about how can we present the objective truth of Islam in an age in which only subjective truths seem to be accepted, in light of what you just said, that it has to be, well, Islamic truths are really anchored in experiential realities and experiential truths.
Well, the problem with the postmodern narrative, which ironically has become a very intolerant and exclusionary one, prompting this extraordinary efflorescence of campus speech codes and cancel culture and so forth, it's suddenly become exactly the authoritarian thing that Foucault and Derrida thought that it couldn't possibly be. They thought it would always be ironic about itself, which it certainly isn't any longer. The problem there is that it's rooted in a kind of Meghan Markle style validation of one's own truth. That the turn to the subject, which has been the Western story since Descartes, if not before, has resulted in a quasi-deification of one's own subjectivity, so that one's own feelings, one's own sense of what ought to be right, one's own sense of victimhood become the ultimate horizon of truth. And that can't be the basis for any kind of social contract, really, or the validation of a universal moral or rights code, because it's far too individualistic and narcissistic. It's escaped in the last 10 years or so from the academy into wider culture, largely because students have been indoctrinated in this, this new critical theory culture. And I think that the consequence is already very, very threatening. Certainly it's maximally intolerant of any religious narrative. And the paradoxes within it, and perhaps you've seen Helen Pluckrose's new book, Cynical Theories, which is a kind of liberal Rawlsian critique of the woke ideology, is that it tends to validate so much as the only remaining thing, the Cartesian self, the I, the mind, the nafs, we would say. But at the same time, as the neuroscientists and a lot of philosophers are saying, the self doesn't really exist anyway. This is the kind of Daniel Dennett idea that we don't have conscious will, that the self is an illusion. It's very kind of Buddhistic, and there's reasons why Buddhism is so attractive to so many in the Western elites, not just because it doesn't trouble you with thought about God, but because it doesn't trouble you with the belief that you actually exist. So it's perfect for postmodernism. So if the self is now the measure of all things, and Megan's story is all that matters to her, but if and that story is rooted in a self that actually doesn't exist at all, but is just a kind of post hoc invention or a flurry of the neurons in a brain that actually is completely predestined, to use the theological term, then it's entirely incoherent and the civilization has come to a standstill. It's the end of philosophy, it's the end of the humanities. Even some of the sciences are being interrogated. They're talking about intersectional approaches to engineering, for instance, now. It's become completely absurd. So in a sense, that offers all kinds of opportunities for religion to reassert itself, because it's shown that a purely secular definition of metaphysics and then human selfhood has turned out not to be feasible. And humanity desperately needs something. But on the other hand, I think that we're seeing many of these social justice issues used as sticks with which to beat traditional religionists. And there's a very strong feminist dimension to Macron's policy against Islam in France, for instance, and Marine Le Pen, who may be the next president next year in France, self-identifies as a feminist. And these social justice issues are coming into the general mood of hostility and phobia to religion generally, but traditional forms of religion, Orthodox Judaism, traditional Catholicism, traditional Islam, in ways that are really going to make the culture war place us, whether we like it or not, very much at the center of things. So I see it as a two-edged sword.
You mentioned critical race theory. It's one thing for social justice warriors to carry it around and as the overarching theory for analyzing everything. How do you make sense of the fact that so many Muslim youth on campuses, of course, in the wake of the retreat of Salafism from campuses and Hizb ut-Tahrir and many other ideologies, how do you make sense of so many bearded, hijabi young Muslims using critical race theory as a lens through which to analyze social realities and even use it as a critique of a Muslim authority and Islamic tradition?
I think it's another expression of Eurocentrism and colonialism. All of these theories have roots that come out of the Western philosophical story from Descartes and then the rebellion against religious meta-narratives unleashed by the Enlightenment, Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, we can, through conscience alone, determine what's right, the turn to the subject. So I think that many young Muslims feel profoundly defeated by modernity. And this is a way of surrendering to it while still maintaining some kind of flag-waving protest identity. But it is profoundly a submission to a powerful Western hegemon, to the dominant discourse. So I see it as the kind of phenomenon that you saw a century ago with a lot of Arabs becoming Marxists, for instance, or a lot of Indian Muslims supporting the Raj, the kind of if you can't beat them, join them pessimism. So I think it's a sign of defeat that they can't bear to be seen as despised outsiders any longer. And so they're joining this carnival towards the woke future because it makes them feel less bad about themselves and makes them feel that many Westerners now approve of them after all. I see it as the reflex of a profound inferiority complex.
How do you respond to the question that constantly comes up that traditional ulama, if you go back to the colonial period, traditional ulama capitulated, as it were, or at least as some of the critics point out, capitulated to colonialism and didn't really know how to respond. Traditional ulama today don't seem to be very vocal about their criticism of oppression in the Middle East and other parts of the world. What is radical about traditional Islam that can still inspire the youth?
Well, the ulama who are embedded in Muslim state structures are not at liberty to say anything that is not prescripted by the security forces in those countries. And people like Jocelyne Cesari and others have talked about the mass governmentalizing of Islam throughout the Islamic world, so that it's difficult now really to look for a prophetic critique of anything to Al-Azhar or to the Mufti of Abu Dhabi or to anyone in particular, because they're so obviously suborned by securitized state apparatus structures that there's very little that they can do. And that is being extended in the Muslim minority situation as well. The French governmentalizing of Islam, which we're now seeing, the creation of a kind of, rather as we have a state church in England, it's a sort of state Islam that they're creating in France now, with massive state subsidies and scrutiny of Muslim structure, imam training at every level. In that kind of securitized traditional Islam, the prophetic voice is again absent. Another point to remember is that historically those who would cry out for the masses and for the downtrodden were not generally the muftis and the ulama and the mujtahids. That wasn't really their role, but it was the Sufis. People like Lahsen Lusi and so forth. There's plenty. Every Muslim culture has its example of the Sufi sheikh who stands up against the sultan on behalf of those who are rioting for bread or so forth. Every Muslim culture has that. To the extent that their independent Waqf-funded institutions no longer exist and the silsilas have come to an end, then that voice is no longer around, unfortunately. So, yeah, the shifting of religious authority in the direction of the Zahir has made the governmentalizing of Islam a lot easier, but has also resulted in the collapse or the disappearance of those classes which historically maintained that prophetic critique most unashamedly.
Moving to the Western context, the political context, a lot of the young Muslim youth are concerned about a lot of social issues like Black Lives Matter. They find themselves having to ally with the left in order to push forward one or two issues. At the same time, in terms of values, they find a lot of they sympathize a lot with the more conservative side of the spectrum. There are issues and problems facing any kind of political engagement, whether with the left or the right. Do you have any reflections on, and it links to one of the questions that someone asked, to what extent should Muslims, in the name of growing roots and getting involved in public discourse and conversations, to what extent can they really get involved in this political process, given the ambiguities and given the conflicting values that they find in these various political parties? Or is Islam a third political way?
Well, I think what humanity needs at the moment is not more protests and structures that are trying to oppose other structures. I think what's needed is prophetic voices, even those who are solitary, who provide an alternative that then creates a kind of melting of the hearts across the political and the cultural spectrum and awakens people to what is really important, which is the vertical dimension. Religion is about the vertical, and I sometimes think that the clash between these sort of postmodern identity movements and Islam is akin to the Ansar and the Muhajirin in Medina, who are separated from the tribes by the Khandaq. On the other side of the Khandaq, the ditch, there's all of these groups talking about ethnicity and identity and pride with their own stories, and each validating their own stories. And on the Muslim side, you have just Tawheed and the melting away of those grievances and those stories through this extraordinary fellowship that was created. So I see that my belief is very difficult to cross that ditch and try to engage with those people where they are, because everything is based on nafs. Their identity is based on a bruised sense of their own entitlement. It's a grievance culture. And unless they're reconnected to the vertical dimension of humanity, which is what their ancestors were, which is probably integral to the proper functioning of the human species, then they're never going to get anything right. They're just a bunch of special interest groups competing against others and complaining and protesting. It won't really make a difference against the huge internationalized corporate and media megastructures of today's world. It really won't. So instead, what we need is to remain faithful to our own traditions and provide that voice which everybody is listening for, particularly, for instance, in the environmental movement, which is pretty secular and spiritless, that indicates that things have a meaning, and that without the meta-narrative, historically they've always been rooted in the sacred, you're never going to find any solutions. So on a local level, you can protest against the killing of a black person on the streets and so forth, and that's a legitimate and often right thing to do. But actually joining the ranks of movements whose qibla is not our qibla is, I think, a kind of betrayal, really, and a dilution and a compromise. And I think that we should be stronger than that. If others wish to join our events, fine. And I think we should be collaborating with other religionists. There's a lot that's interesting in Catholic social teaching, for instance. And across the board in the world religions, there's plenty of people who see the solution to problems of discrimination, marginalization, refugees, immigration, whatever, as lying within their religious traditions. But to jump on a secular bandwagon is a very strange thing for a religious person to want to do. Again, it's part of an inferiority complex, I think, that they want to be loved.
In the absence of a clear political theology or clear political, social, spiritual narrative out there, I mean, one of the questions was, I mean, mashallah, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, you have the ability to articulate and think about things very clearly. A lot of other people, perhaps more action-oriented, need a compass, a clear discourse, a clear narrative that they can adopt, and one that's really articulated in a language that they can understand today, can relate to issues today. In the absence of that, what do you advise these youth to do?
Well, the traditional young person, especially the male, I suppose, was initiated. In every culture, there was an initiation by the elders of the teenager, which was an initiation into manhood, but also into the belief system and the moral system of the tribe. That's fundamental to being part of the human family. We've always had those rituals and those ceremonies, and part of that means the lesson of overcoming self and exploring transcendence. So modernity only believes in nafs. We believe in ruh and the nafs as being something that is a kind of trap and an illusion, something unreal. And all the religions really agree on that. This is not specifically Islamic. So the big fight, the futuwa for young people, has to be overwhelming against the lower self. Unless that's subdued and one becomes a beautiful, balanced, restrained, courteous person, full of compassion rather than anxiety, one is never going to resolve any of these issues, but just becomes another turbulent, shouting voice in the crowd. So we need to rediscover those traditions of futuwa. And again, part of the problem, and one of the things I'm probably not making many friends over in the book, is that I'm very critical of Sufism in the West, and the fact that the traditional policy of the Ummah when it expanded into a new territory was, first of all, before the muftis and the qadis and any of that got going, was to create the Sufi lodges and the shrines and that infrastructure, which was the network of Islamization. We haven't really done that in the Western world. And as a result, there's a whole dimension of the religion and the deepening of people's faith, which is simply absent, and people don't have any access to it. Where do you go if you want to go to a Muslim retreat center, for instance, for a weekend? You can do it with a Buddhist or with a Christian monastery. Where do you do it? In Australia, for instance. Are there established places the way they used to be across the Muslim world? Plenty of Turks in Australia. Before Ataturk, there were 400 Sufi lodges just in Istanbul. It was just part of Muslim life for the training of akhlaq and adab and futuwa, sacrifice, beauty. Where is that now? So yeah, we need to deepen our infrastructure, I think, and to create those places. And that's where young people, especially young men, need to be trained, because that's the real jihad. Unless you've sorted that one out, then any social struggle is just going to have you running around in circles.
Sita, we have about 10-15 minutes left. So I want to ask you one final one question that's really dear to my heart, and it has come up before. I remember walking with you from the Cambridge Muslim College to Cambridge Mosque, and you mentioned a wonderful link, I suppose, between Uhud and Uluru. I picked up on something in your conversation about that, and I turned it into a short story in one of the curriculum stories that I'm writing at school, for a school. Is the indigenous community and its rich spiritual heritage a way of Muslims here in Australia really growing strong roots? And if so, can you give pointers in the right direction or indications of how we might do that?
Well, yeah, and this doesn't just apply to Australia, but to the relationship of Muslims with First Nations in Canada and elsewhere. And this is not just about the natural Muslim solidarity with those who have been wronged, often by the same colonial and imperial forces that wronged the ancestors of many Muslim migrants. But it's also about implementing the Quranic insistence that of God's signs is ikhtilafu alsinatikum wa alwanikum. So we don't just respect them on kind of flat human rights grounds, but because they contain unique ways of being human through their language, which really means culture, and everything about them, including their alwanikum, which is their embodied nature, which is a sign of God. And that's uniquely Islamic, I think. You don't find passages like that in the Bible. The Bible, on the contrary, has the legend of the Tower of Babel. So the multiplicity of human languages for the biblical authors is a curse. Whereas for the Quran, you don't get that story. You get the idea that it's a blessing. So to see them as signs of God, different manifestations of the possibility of Bani Adam, and to assume that in their ancestors there were prophetic figures and awliya, and that they have a natural sensitivity to the sacralities of the landscape, which is part of being primordially human and healthy. But recognizing that they themselves may not agree on a number of things to do with the dream time, the nature of the land, the competitions between them as well. But yeah, I think that part of the deep wisdom of Islam historically and its capacity for inculturation has been that it recognizes the validity, not just the usefulness, but the validity of forms of inculturation. And with the very deracinated, globalized forms of Islam that we get nowadays, mediated by print media and the internet, that's become a lot harder. So it's a challenge for Muslims in Australia, if you like, to become not just the kind of rights champions of those people and to point out, what has the white man brought to them, really? The Church of England and alcohol, that's the main impact. And neither of those has really raised them up too much. That the Islamic view does give them an alternative, which is not just an affirmation of a primordial lifestyle, which is not going to work. If you're working in an office in Melbourne, for instance, you can't do all of those things any longer because it's too fixed for a particular context, geophysical context, but can be the basis of and can be resourced by people who are facing the Kaaba in the universal monotheism of Islam, but in a way that recognizes that in a way which other religious traditions can't. So one could start by incorporating forms of Aboriginal abstract art, for instance, in the Muslim aesthetic, in mosque decoration, for instance. I suggested this at the Gallipoli Mosque in Sydney once to the Turkish elders, and it was regarded with some astonishment. But I think the newer generation is going to see that this is the Islamic thing to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So while we've been listening to your answers, Sheikh, people have been sending in questions. Matthew, do you want to join us again with any outstanding questions? I think about 10 questions there. Matthew and Malik, are there any questions that we can go through?
There are quite a few questions here. You've asked really interesting ones, but there are a lot of questions here, and I'm just going through them now to make sure we haven't already covered off on some of these things already. Dr. Samir, is there anything there that you see?
There's one that stands out actually. It has been mentioned several times. Shaykh Abdal Hakim, you're well known for your scholarship on Imam al-Ghazali, and you've taken him as a paradigm for revival in our age. Some have been asking about whether you see one or two other significant Islamic figures who are necessary today, or whose perspectives are necessary today for any Islamic revival. Ibn Arabi and Shaykh Waliullah were mentioned in particular.
I think it depends on people's context, educational level, needs, whether they're in a dawah situation or not. Ibn Arabi, until about 100 years ago, was somebody just about everybody across the Ummah agreed with. Whether you were at Al-Azhar or in India or Sumatra, it was just part of being Muslim. The Ottomans, the ulama, the muftis all wrote commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam, just about. That was just part of normal Islamic life. The question, however, with Ibn Arabi is whether that hugely nuanced and complex and gigantic cosmology, ageology, metaphysical system is something that people can really, on a mass level, get their heads around today. And I would suspect probably not. I think that for most Muslims nowadays, especially in a soundbite age, we need forms of a kind of mystical pietism that are less elaborate, with those complex systems, which in any case are always in danger of being misunderstood. And Ibn Arabi is an example of somebody who's regularly and disastrously misunderstood, should be left to academics, senior ulama, people involved in interfaith dialogue and so forth, independent theologians. But I don't think Ibn Arabi ever saw himself as writing for the masses. In fact, deliberately, he encodes his teachings within his books, and that's why they sometimes seem to be so difficult. So, yeah, I think that the mainstream Muslim discourse of the future is going to be, if it succeeds, quite different to the inherited kind of ethnically specific religious discourses that Muslims encounter in the mosques now, and that to the younger generation often don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But it's going to be rooted, probably it's going to be more explicitly scriptural, but focusing on neglected aspects of scripture, the divine names Ar-Rahman, Rahim, the historic inclusivity of Islamic culture, respect for differences of opinion, the culture of ambiguity, and an understanding that the early Muslims, the Salaf, were people who, really more than any other generation in Islamic history, validated and respected difference. If you look at the early Maliki texts, the Mudawwana, the Utbiyah, and so forth, which are detailed records of the Islam of the Salaf, it's all about scholars disagreeing but respecting each other.
Matthew, is there anything else that stands out for you?
I guess there's one question. How do we engage, Sheikh, how do we engage with both Muslims and non-Muslims? as described here, with post-liberal or millennial values, who cite Muslim values like compassion and respect. I believe that this is in relation to issues around the LGBTQI question, marriage, that kind of thing. This is an enormous issue, a growing issue, both here and obviously in Europe and all over the world. I hope that question is clear.
Yeah, I think, again, here we have a case for establishing significant partnerships with other traditional religionists from other ummahs. And it's another example of how it can be very difficult and destabilizing to create partnerships with secular, materialistic, globalized, postmodern movements. There is a larger number of conservative people around, even quite secular people, who are really unhappy with a lot of the movements that have been happening in society in the last 20, 30 years, but they don't know how to express themselves, or they're afraid of doing so. And I think that it really is the responsibility of religious communities to risk unpopularity and to speak prophetically and clearly about what they take to be truth. Being apologetic and too strategic is not really the prophetic way. One has to risk unpopularity, I think. That would be my my general sense of that. But it has to be done with considerable wisdom and discretion.
You want to get Matthew?
Sorry, yeah, go on.
I think there's time for one more. I have a large number of friends who are sociologists and work with the humanities, and they found your use of shirk al-asbab associated with sociological analysis quite interesting. Can you elaborate a little bit on that kind of relationship?
Yeah, sociology has so many rival interpretations within it that I'm not sure it can really claim to be a science or a logia in any traditional sense. It has certain useful sub-branches, sort of demographic, statistical approaches can be useful in measuring things. But in terms of interpretation, I think the human self is such an unpredictable thing, and ultimately something subject to divine subcurrents, that it's never going to come up with a theory of what it is to be human. And the idea that human beings are simply the passive consequence of social and economic and class changes, something that seems to be a conviction beyond the bounds of traditional Marxism these days, I think is quite dehumanizing and negates the significance of individuals who are, in the Hegelian sense, kind of capable of creating a new synthesis and going against the zeitgeist. So there's something dehumanizing, I think, about a certain deterministic and reductionist sociology that I think religious people are going to find quite concerning.
So it's really a question of rehumanizing or allowing humans to fully realize their humanity, really, in that sense. I think we've hit the limit of 1 hour. Maghrib is coming up in a few minutes. A lot of people will have to go and pray, inshallah. Matthew, do you want to add anything before we end the session?
Only to say thank you very much, and what a great honor to have you, Shaykh, for this period of time early in the morning before breakfast. And thank you also, Dr. Samir, for the last few weeks of wonderful focus on this particular book. We could go on for many, many more weeks, actually, I'm sure.
Inshallah. Yeah. Thank you very much, Shaykh Abdal Hakim. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Mizan Avenue. Thank you, Islamic Research, Arabic and Research League. We're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, there are a few more questions. There were a lot of requests in the chat group to bring you down under. One final question: is there a possibility in the next 2 years, if COVID is over and travel is possible? Inshallah.
To Australia, I always like visiting Australia. Yes, if you can get me there without having to sit in an airborne prison for 24 hours beforehand, that would be wonderful.
Inshallah, we'll try our best, inshallah, in the next year or two to bring you out to Australia. Inshallah. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and inshallah, you have a lovely evening and a blessed Ramadan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.